All right. Welcome and good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are coming from today. We are so excited that you chose to be here with us. Excited that about this conversation that we're going to have about a really tough issue. My name is Meagan Pollock, and I am based out of Southeast Texas in a small town called Orange. And my company is called Engineer Inclusion, and I get to help people and organizations intentionally and systematically engineer equity and inclusion into their organizations. And I am excited about this topic. I'm excited about this panel of people, and I'm going to introduce them to you in just a second. But I just want to do a little bit of housekeeping first. So I want to invite you all to test this out and introduce yourselves to us, your name, your role, your location, and why you chose to attend today. And while you all do that, I want to introduce you to my colleagues who are joining me here today. So Dr. Sabrina Brandon Ricks, she and I are this is how this workshop happened. We met, I don't know, at some point over the pandemic, like many virtual friends, and we just became friends and we've been chatting since. And we're like, we need to talk about this, right? So she's an expert in workplace bullying, and I am an expert in diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And we thought, hey, we need to have a rich conversation about this. So lots of credit goes to her and how this panel came to be. And so Dr. Ricks is the president of SBR Workplace Leadership Services, which specializes in developing healthy organizational cultures by providing training and workshops and designing curriculums regarding various management and leadership topics, emphasizing workplace bullying prevention. She has a PhD from Capella University in organization and management with specialization in leadership. She is also an adjunct professor. She's also a professor for the Northern Virginia Community College. You may have to correct me on that. Liz Tremblay. Liz, wave and say hi. So Liz is an undercover geographer passing as an IT business system supervisor for the City of Charlotte's Public Safety IT. She helps technical and non-technical people come together to solve problems, creating solutions and implement changes to how they do things to improve people's lives and jobs. She has a really interesting story, and really what she wanted to bring today is her lived experience, certainly in the workforce, but also bringing that experience as a manager as well. And then finally, Shelly Carter, she is a retired fire captain from serving over 20 plus years for the city of Hartford. She began her career with the department in 1999 and was promoted to various things. But since Captain Carter's retirement, she was named the Operations and Training Manager for the Department of Emergency Services and Public Protection within the Division of Emergency Management and Homeland Security. And she's also got a really cool nonprofit that she serves with as well. And so I'm so grateful for you all to be here with us. And do any of you want to say a quick hello before we dive into the questions?
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for being here. I'm excited to be a part of this group today.
Shelly, if you're chatting, we can't hear you. You're still muted. Oh, wait, hold on.
Thank you. It wasn't allowing me to unmute. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much to Dr. Pollock for having me here on this panel. It's good to be here, and it's good to have this very courageous conversation. I'm super excited about the outcomes of this at this time. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. So glad you're here. And thanks to everyone for chiming in here on the chat. I see we've got lots of people here, and I'm so grateful that you've joined us. Okay, so as a reminder, everything that we're going to share, lots of books that I'm sharing are going to be on my website. So you don't have to capture all the links. I'm going to try to curate them, everything that we share there. So you also have all of our bios and contact information. And so also whatever else comes out of this, we're going to add it there. So to start us off, Dr. Ricks, you have researched and studied workplace bullying. Can you start us off with a definition of workplace bullying and clarify how it differs from harassment and discrimination?
Absolutely. So when we're talking about workplace bullying, we're talking about a scenario where we have a bully and we have a target, and there are unwanted behaviors between the two, which might consist of something like shouting, insults, humiliation, exclusion, manipulation of work, such as giving you too many tasks or not enough tasks based on what your skill set might be. And so these unwanted behaviors typically take place over 2 to 3 times a week for 2 to 3 weeks or more. And it's based on perception. And so an individual is going to have to think, hey, I feel like I'm being bullied. I feel like I'm being mistreated. Unfortunately, this usually tends to create an aggressive or a hostile work environment for that person, which in many cases also tends to lead to having stress-related responses. So an individual now is all of a sudden having things like headaches and stomach aches, and they're not performing as well at work or able to even come to work because of these stress-related factors. Now, in regards to the difference between harassment and discrimination, the main difference is that workplace bullying does not have any federal or state laws to protect you. So for you to say, hey, somebody's mistreating me because they don't like me, it's going to be kind of a too bad type of response that you're going to get from the law. Now, as far as harassment and discrimination is concerned, of course, we know with discrimination, there are protected categories that an individual may fall in. Maybe that's race, maybe that's national origin, maybe that's gender, sexual orientation, disability, and so on. And so if you are being mistreated because you can prove, and it will be a burden of proof, that someone has discriminated against you because you fall in a protected class, then it's deemed harassment. And again, this is something that is repeated. This is covered by law. So those are the main two differences. You can most certainly be bullied and not be in a protected class. Okay, so I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Dr. Ricks.
Absolutely.
When we had the open poll, we had some people share some of their examples of bullying behavior. And so I want us to just kind of look at these for a second. And as we look at these 3 examples, I want you all to think about, you all as the audience, think about maybe when have you experienced bullying? So this person shared, I'm a hard worker and was initially encouraged to speak up at meetings and ask questions. Within a month of starting my position, my supervisor started calling me out during meetings and snapping at my questions or concerns. I thought it was just me until colleagues brought the issue to my attention. The situation isn't always bad, but sometimes they are nice and friendly, but often I am snapped at in public forums and it embarrasses me, especially as I know that I am meeting expectations and hitting deadlines. Another person shared, I was in a conference room full of men and one of them didn't like the collective approach I was choosing. He shouted at me, "That's not how this is going to work." Everyone remained silent. Their silence caused a lot of harm. And then the final story we have here, a former supervisor screamed at me because she disagreed with me. After I left the unit, she asked to meet with me and accused me of bad-mouthing her in the unit. Then she told me that she knew lots of people in my field and could ruin my career if she wanted to. Now, there's a similarity between these 3 stories, and they all sort of involve people screaming, right? So first of all, folks, screaming doesn't really belong in the workplace. We can have another conversation on communication strategies. But I want to ask you all, and then ask to the panelists, have you ever experienced bullying in the workplace? And is there a story that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I'll take one of those. I definitely, being a woman and a woman of color in the fire service, it has, fire service is supposedly or has in the past been known as a place for men. And so initially when I first came on the job, it was very noted that, and this is back in 1999, mind you, that women was not as welcome as they are now. So there's a point of your being a new recruit or a new employee where you have to prove yourself as a new person, whether you're male, female, whatever, because it's a very dangerous, high stakes job and career. But once that is done, it's not a matter of proving yourself to the point of having to ensure that no one attacks you or harasses you or bullies you because you are female. And so a lot of what we had to deal with and what I had to deal with back early on in my career was not just approving myself, but it was more so of, you really don't belong here. You're not supposed to be here because you are female. And as I began to climb through the ranks of, making driver, becoming a lieutenant, becoming a captain, those subtle hints of you don't belong here never really became vocal, as until I really began to climb through the ranks and become higher in my organization. And then, it was like, listen, I've already proven myself. I don't have to do that anymore. But there are times of definite bullying from folks who just really expected me to go away, which just, of course, that didn't happen. So.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Shelly. And so I'm an engineer, also a non-traditional field for women. And one of the things I learned is that we have to work 10 times harder to get sort of half as much, right? And I think that when you overlap that with other intersecting identities, that even more complicates it. And so there's sort of this sort of insidious nature that can happen within the culture of any kind of organization. No matter the values of the organization is still made up of people, they can create these kinds of cultures where it affects us in powerful ways.
Right.
Liz or Dr. Ricks, anything you want to add here?
Unfortunately, I have experienced workplace bullying in many capacities, also in the fire service, and it's a tricky thing because, like I said before, you can't always tell if it's just simply bullying or if it's because you're being mistreated because of one of those protected categories. And so that's kind of the target's burden to have to prove. But in my scenario, there was just a lot of coming at me, so to speak, constantly questioning me, my abilities, my skills. Can you do it? More so than other individuals. So that was one of the things that I experienced. And so I do talk about this a lot more. I share my stories, and I know you're going to share this, Dr. Pollock, later. I share my stories in a book that I wrote that was released last year called Bullied at Work, My Journey of Growth and Perseverance. And so kind of what I learned through the process and being able to better recognize some of the behaviors that you could potentially experience.
Sure. I absolutely have experienced bullying, and I use those experiences as I transition to a manager so that I can make sure that I'm not allowing bullying to happen to my employees by others or myself. It's a lot of self-awareness and a lot of paying attention to yourself. But my bullying led to some complex PTSD and severe anxiety issues. So I don't know if it's fortunate or unfortunate. Mine wasn't because I'm more in the engineering field like you. Mine was less about my gender. And so it was more, there's always the microaggressions that go with the gender. But I wasn't bullied for my gender. I was bullied because of other issues. So.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. Yeah, so Nasser has a great sort of prompt in the chat. Even though we had about 33% say that they haven't experienced bullying in the workplace, I would surmise or hope maybe that I don't hope that they've seen bullying, but I imagine that they have seen bullying behavior. And so why is bullying an issue, right? How does it affect us in the workplace? And so when we look at, the well-known Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we can look at the sort of basic needs here is that we need to have a physiological and safety needs met, right? And if we're in a hostile environment, if we're in an environment where we are being attacked, even if it is invisible to other people, if we are feeling attacked, if we are feeling harassed, that creates an environment where we can't truly function. It also deeply affects our capacity to feel like we belong. And belonging and feeling valued. These are fundamental human needs. And we have to be able to perceive that we are a valued member of a team, and we have to experience treatment that satisfies our needs for belongingness and uniqueness in the workplace. If we don't do that, then we can't get anything done, folks, right? It becomes a cognitive load that is literally jamming up your bandwidth, that reduces your capacity to engage at 100%, right? If your mental bandwidth is unconsciously at times jammed with like, I don't feel safe, I feel like I'm being attacked, I feel like I don't belong, that is reducing the amount of bandwidth that's left that allows you to actually engage all of your cognitive capacities to do a job that you probably want to do and you want to do well. And so bullying is an issue because it reduces people's capacity to reach their potential. It reduces their capacity to feel like they belong. And so it is something that we have to understand and truly begin to address as well. Now,
Pollock,
yeah, go ahead.
real quick on that. If you, not that anyone else's career or job is less important, but in the fire and emergency services, there is no time for second guessing. There is no time for trying to figure out if you really should do something when the bell hits, when it's time for you to get in your gear and arrive at that fire scene or that emergency. If you have been bullied, if you have been harassed, and you are trying to do your job to the best of your ability, and you know that you're spot on with it, that the self-esteem that you lose from the bully causes the ability to really do your job and to do it safely and effectively. And so not only, I'm not just speaking on the fire service, when you take a broader picture of that across the country, across different career paths, people don't want to second guess when they have educated themselves and have worked hard to get to the positions where they are. Bullying really does affect how they manage, how they do their jobs. And so it's important to have this conversation and to understand how it really does affect folks, especially those in the fire and emergency services.
I think that's a really great point. As a consultant, like there's very little that requires like instant action, right? But we forget about those people who are trying to save lives, right? They need to be able to have all their faculties. So it's a great point.
Mm-hmm.
So Liz, you, when we were talking a few weeks ago, getting ready for this, you shared this book with me called The Sociopath Next Door by Dr. Martha Stout. And so I immediately started listening to it because it was something I'd been thinking about. And so Dr. Stout shares in her book that as many as 4% of the population, so that's 1 in 24, right? 1 in 24 people are conscienceless sociopaths who have no empathy or affectionate feelings for humans or animals. And she says that a sociopath is defined as someone who displays at least 3 of 7 distinguishing characteristics, such as deceitfulness, impulsivity, and lack of remorse. And so most often such people have such a superficial charm, which they exercise ruthlessly in order to get what they want. So in looking this up, I realized she also just wrote another book. This came out, I think, last year. So I've got to read this one now to learn how to outsmart all the sociopaths in my life. But so Liz, I wanted to ask you, why do you think it's important for us to recognize when we may be dealing with a sociopath who's bullying us in the workplace?
Well, I started by reading this book, but when it came down to it, it didn't really matter if you're dealing with a sociopath or not. I think it's important for you to realize that when you're being bullied, it has nothing to do with you. It has to do with the other person. So, and it's always going to have to do with the other person. And one of the things that I learned from my experiences is that when the essence of a motive is self-interest and self-preservation. So every action that's coming at you, they're responding to those 2 motives. Either they're wanting to get something done, or they are feeling threatened and they're responding to that. With sociopaths, it gets a little more complicated because there's no connection to another human being. So your strategies are a lot more limited in how you can respond to those individuals, because you can't speak to their self-interest to try to get them to not bully you, and you can't work on creating that connection with them so that they don't feel threatened. So there are different, strategies that you can use to try and create a connection with an individual that aren't available to you with sociopathic individuals, whether they're sociopathic physiologically or they're sociopathic socially. So they've created that disconnection with other people because of something about them. They don't see somebody as human because they're not like them in some way. So some people don't view women as human. Some people don't view people of color as human. And that kind of that's a different kind of sociopathy that is less physiological. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, for sure. And so what you brought up there in the end is you talked about people who have deep-seated ideologies, right? About women, about people of color, about people with disabilities. So those deep-seated ideologies, we're going to talk in a little bit about sort of systems of advantage in business.
Completely separate.
Yeah. And so those kinds of ideologies, those are still something really important to recognize. And, one of the things that I'm in the business of change. So I want to believe that everybody has the capacity to change. Otherwise I wouldn't do this work. But in reading that book, it made me realize that there are some times when there are people that aren't ever going to be willing to change because of their sociopathy. And so I thought it was an interesting point to bring up in this conversation is that if you think that you're dealing with someone who is at that level, and again, 1 in 24 people, folks, that is something really important for you may have to take extraordinary measures to protect yourself from that person, because you aren't going to be able to build a connection and appeal to their inner senses because they don't have them. So the question here now to the broader group is why does bullying occur? And we've got some contributions from the audience, discrimination. It looks like maybe we're getting some kind of jumbled sentences here, but something around feeling power. Certainly power is a really big piece of this, lack of self-confidence. What else to the panelists? Why else does bullying occur?
Just to piggyback a little bit on what Ms. Liz was just sharing, when bullying is taking place, it again usually doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the target per se. Just like Liz was describing, it's all about the bully. And on the inside, it sounds a little cliche, but something has happened at some point in their life. And so when they come across you as the target, you might trigger them because you remind them of someone from childhood who maybe mistreated them or so on and so forth, or B, they are just simply intimidated by you and threatened by the fact that you have skills and capabilities that may put you ahead of them in the workforce. So they're looking for a way to tear you down before that happens. But again, it all goes back to a problem with the bully. And so I don't want to jump into action steps just yet, but I do just want to share that little bit about why bullying might be occurring.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dr. Ricks. Yeah, so insecurity as the audience is contributing is certainly a big piece of that. And I from what I've read in the research, I understand that's certainly true. So,
also managing, sorry.
Go ahead.
I've noticed that sometimes bullying is a response to managing anxiety or trust issues. So if someone is struggling with anxiety, they might try to micromanage in order to manage that anxiety. And that micromanagement can come out as bullying because they're trying very much to control a situation in order to control their anxiety, to stem the anxiety that they're feeling, and without consideration of the effects of what they're doing on another person. It doesn't make it less bullying, but it's usually it's about the other person, or maybe they have trust issues. And in both of those cases, anxiety and trust issues, there's a self-fulfilling prophecy. They create the situations that gave them the anxiety in the first place, or that they think violated their trust by that self-fulfilling prophecy of, I can't trust this person, so I need to do all these things because I can't trust this person. And then they create the situation in which they're then losing more trust. So those things also create those problems as well.
Yeah, great point, Liz. And Sabrina, Dr. Ricks shares a story of being micromanaged in her book. So if you want to read more about her story there as well. Shelly, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that sometimes, more often than not, bullying is a learned behavior. So you got to meet people where they are and understand and find out exactly where this person is. Sometimes it's a coping mechanism for folks who have had past traumas and past bullying themselves. And their only course of communicating and reaction, if you will, is to continue that circle or that cycle of bullying moving forward in their lives. So of course we can talk about at some point how we can deal with the bully themselves, but you have to, as a person who could possibly be a target, you have to understand that this is a learned behavior, and someone had just mentioned a trigger. Whatever I've done, let's say as the target, might trigger that in that person who is the bully.
Yeah, thanks, Shelly. So when we posted the opportunity for people to provide questions, there were 3 themes and the questions that people submitted. And so that was a theme of backlash, privilege, and action, right? How do we address the workplace bullying? And so let's talk about backlash first. So the sort of broad question is here is how do we navigate the potential backlash and reporting workplace bullying that you've either experienced or witnessed? So let me offer that to the panelists. And the participants, please chime in as well on the poll.
I would say, like, being very concerned about the backlash. If you know anything about the fire and emergency services, you know we are considered family, and we are considered brothers and sisters, and we spend 24 hours together, and we literally place our lives in the hands of the person that's standing next to you, whether they like you or not. And so what the backlash would be, as a target, if you will, I am stepping out of the family to tell on someone in the family. And it's very frightening to step out of your family. If this is all you know, and knowing that at some point I might have to go into a structure fire with this person that might be bullying me, it's very, very scary to report, because now at this point it leaves me as the target vulnerable to what could possibly happen to my career, what could happen to my life, for that matter. And so it was very difficult for me and for others that I know of to report the whole bullying situation that we've experienced. The thing you have to remember, if you will, as a target, is that it's not about you. As Liz often said, it's not about you as an individual. So you cannot hold that into yourself and turn it into yourself. If you are being harassed or bullied, you have to make it known to someone else to move forward and get past that situation.
And then
Part of,
also,
oh, sorry.
oh, no, go ahead.
Part of, one of the my background, some of my education is in Homeland Security, and so I've studied terrorism a lot. And one of the things that's very similar to bullying is a lot of the actions and strategies used by terrorists are very much similar to what is used by a bully, but on a smaller scale. So a lot of times a bully, their hope is to intimidate you and to scare you into complying with what they want. And that action will often make you less likely to report because you're afraid of what's going to happen. Just like 9/11 and all those other things were intended to make you afraid and make you not do something. The same action is going on with a bully. So the backlash, you're afraid of being invalidated, you're afraid of being gaslighted, you're afraid that you'll be micromanaged further, or everything will become even more uncomfortable. You'll be isolated further because they're going to try to isolate you and keep you so that they can give the narrative of who you are to others, because that's helping them in their ability to control your reality and perception.
And what I would add to that in regards to in that office setting, the backlash that you might get is that first off, you may be deemed to be a troublemaker, kind of like what Captain Carter was sharing a little bit earlier. So you're kind of further outcast. And then secondly, you might put yourself in a situation where you might get fired or feel like you're pushed to quit. And, honestly, there's a number of things that could happen outside of being bullied that could present that risk. So you really have to put yourself first and decide that you need to protect yourself, even at that risk, when it really comes down to it.
Yeah, so what we're describing certainly depends on the size of an organization. If you're talking about a big sort of corporate entity, as somebody put in the chat, often HR is meant to support the organization, not necessarily you. But I do know, like in some organizations, particularly higher ed, there are roles like ombudsmans. So they are more likely to be these sort of outside person who you can talk to. I had success with that and talking to an ombudsman during my doctoral program about an issue. And guess what? The issue stopped. It was addressed. And so the key word that they had me use is they said, you need to use the word harassment. And that was a trigger to make some action to begin to stop. And so certainly we know that navigating potential backlash is a key part of this, right? As was mentioned on the previous slide, your contributions is that power plays a big role in this. And how power and hierarchy show up in organization is a function of culture. One of the questions that we had submitted is that sometimes bullying rises to legal harassment, and it can be addressed that way. Some bullying is just toxic culture. How can that be addressed? This also connects back to Juan Mejia's comment in the chat. He said, when you have all of these sort of microaggressive events that, someone experiences as bullying, but they're sort of very hard to prove, So what do we do? How can it be addressed when it becomes a sort of toxic culture? What if HR and their management aren't supportive?
I definitely believed for you to take a self-evaluation if you are the target and just realize how important you are to yourself. And so you have to, it's really hard to see yourself in a positive light if everyone is, or if there's folks that are bullying you and harassing you. But if you step away from the situation and just take a really deep dive into who you are as a person, what your capabilities are, and really start to build yourself up, and definitely seek professional help, which is what I did. It was really important for me to really understand that I was capable, and I am, educated, and I am capable of doing my job regardless of what the bully was trying to make me feel. And so please don't see yourself as the problem, because you're not the problem. And so once you really, it's kind of like the light switch kind of turns on and you're going, wait a minute, I think I really am amazing. And so when you start to believe that and move towards those goals, and understand that you are really not the problem, then at this point you can start to build your own self-esteem back up and use the professional help that's out there for you, such as mentorships. And if your HR is not doing what they're supposed to be doing, do you go and you find another avenue or source that will help you and protect you in this type of situation?
You may find situations in which HR departments are just not well versed when it comes to these types of topics. And so they will avoid putting together policies and procedures and things like that against these sort of things just because they really don't know. And they're not going to tell you they don't know. And so that's when you want to take a proactive approach to say, hey, look, I know we don't have policies and procedures in place to protect anyone against bullying. I know we don't have training or anything like that. How about I go and do the research, bring you some drafts of some other policies and procedures that are out there. I can maybe even put together a short presentation to help train our folks on how to make sure they understand this, how to recognize it, how to report it, and so on. And you may just be the person who makes the transition in your organization. I've done this. And you might get some pushback in the beginning, but then when you start presenting information like, let's just look at what happens when productivity goes down. Let's just look at what happens when customers and clientele are impacted by this. And when organizations start looking at the bottom line and the outcome, then they'll go, oh, okay, yeah, maybe this is something we want to look into.
Yeah, I want to make sure I acknowledge that we are not demonizing HR people, right? I have been given feedback once that I didn't talk very nicely of HR. And I have to say it's because I had experiences, bad experiences, right? And not feeling safe to talk to HR. So if we do have any HR folks on on the call, if people who are watching the recording, please know that I'm sure you are fully aware of the perceptions that people face on you, and we want to help kind of bridge those gaps. And so much of that comes down to the kinds of culture that we create in our organizations. This really is a good way to segue to the next section. But, you know, when we think about what we're experiencing and how we are parts of systems, organizations, oftentimes these systems weren't built for us, right? If you have a marginalized identity, or if you've been a group that has been traditionally excluded, these systems that we exist in weren't built for us, and so they don't often work for us. And so the second theme that came up in the questions was that of privilege. And so I want to give a couple of definitions to kind of set up this part of the conversation. So the first kind of language we want to talk about is that of a dominant group or a subordinate group. And so the dominant group is that which holds the most power in a given society, while the subordinate groups are those who lack the power compared to that dominant group. And so the dominant group is most often in the majority, but not necessarily. And then this leads us to talk about privilege. So privilege, this is that special right, that unearned advantage or immunity granted or available only to a particular person or a group. And this really becomes a system of advantage. And it's a system of advantage based on multiple constructs of our identity: race, gender, socioeconomic status, your religion. And so this list, these are kinds of lists of those whom have privilege. If you're a Christian, heterosexual, able-bodied, if you have depending on your nationality, your level of education, right-handed people have privilege, right? Your geographic location, if you speak English, birth order, your age, body size. So there are lots of different things that grant us privilege that we may not recognize. And so just as we have systems of advantage, those unearned privileges, we also have systems of disadvantage and systems of oppression. And so one of the questions we're going to talk about here in a second talks about how these ideologies, these oppressive natures, can then become internalized within the marginalized groups. So it's a little outside the scope of what we're going to talk about today, but if you want to learn more about this, I've got some more resources that you can access. But the important thing to know is that there are ideologies, interpersonal. These are those micro messages, micro aggressive kinds of behaviors that happen between me and you. Then those things are institutionalized in our policies and procedures. And these external things, interpersonal, institutional, ideological, they then influence people who have then been marginalized to sometimes believe those things to be true, right? And so sometimes we don't always see and feel the oppression because it's been so internalized in us that we actually believe those things. So in what ways does privilege or systems of advantage, disadvantage often render bullying behaviors invisible?
So what I've found is that if an individual is in a marginalized group and they're used to, if you will, backing down or stepping back, they may not feel they have a voice to speak up. So it's going to take your own self-awareness to realize that regardless of who you are and what groups you fall into, you have a voice. So if someone is mistreating you, especially in the workplace in which we're talking about in this particular case, you can speak to this person. You have that right. It doesn't matter what their rank is, title, what have you, where they are in the hierarchical structure of that organization. Mistreatment is mistreatment, and you deserve to be respected no matter what. So speak up for yourself. And I don't want to get too much into the action part of things, but I'll just give you the preliminary information by saying it needs to be a one-on-one conversation.
Another similar question is, are people with disabilities, especially those with invisible disabilities or people who are neurodiverse, are they more likely to be bullied? That was a question submitted to us.
I can speak to this a little bit. And I think I provided you with a link to some research on neurodiverse identification by neurotypicals, and that has to do with the fact that within a very short period of time, it's often described as that person is different or weird or quirky or whatever, even if the person isn't significantly inhibited by any part of their job. They can do their job just fine. Maybe they're even very good at their job. They're more often to be bullied because of issues having to do with the ability to respond correct socially. So they may not be quite as good at responding to a situation because they don't know how. There's also the issue of masking. A lot of neurodiverse people will mask or mirror the people that they're working with or in a room. And so that will tend to create a situation in which people who don't like to be mirrored or don't like to see themselves because that's what they get from someone who's neurodiverse, and that tends to create an issue. Additionally, for neurodiverse people, we tend to want to connect with other people. So we'll tell a story about something to try to connect to someone. And that can very often be very similar in a way that narcissism is perceived when somebody's always talking about themselves. And so for some reason, that tends to attract those types of people because they're hearing somebody else talk about themselves, not realizing that that person really isn't talking about themselves per se, as much as trying to create a connection, something that I have that is like yours, so that we can create a connection. And that is therefore creates this disconnect in what's going on within the relationship. And that will increase the amount of opportunities for neurodivergent individuals to put themselves in situations unknowingly.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. And so, as we talked about previously, people with disabilities, invisible or not, they lack the same amount of power that dominant groups have. So they are, by definition, going to be more likely targeted and at a disadvantage based on the systems and how they were sort of built. Another question before we pivot here to action is, how might internalized oppression prevent someone from realizing that they're being bullied? And I really liken this to like telling a fish that water is wet. This is something that I experienced as a woman in engineering, is that, I only knew what it was like to be a woman in engineering. I had never really had my little rose-colored glasses ripped off. So I didn't know that it was bullying, because it's just what happened. People just treated me that way, right? And it wasn't until I started participating in like women in engineering groups, and they're like talking about this stuff, I was like, oh, you mean that's not okay? And I had no idea, right? Because it's just what was happening. And so I think that it happens more often than not, because as a survival tactic, as someone who is one, amongst many, you try to assimilate, you try to adapt, you try to fit in, and you really lose yourself, a lot of yourself in a part of that. And so you aren't always aware of those things that happen. And so certainly surrounding yourself with other people who understand and can be your allies is going to be really important. And so leading to this sort of last section, the last key part of the questions is, what do we do? I want to start this section with one of my favorite quotes from Janetta Sagan. And she said, "Silence in the face of injustice is complicity with the oppressor." And in Dr. Rick's book on Bullied at Work, A Journey of Growth and Perseverance, I'm going to drop the link here in the chat in just a second. And in her book, she outlines a 5-part model of response following observation of workplace bullying. So Dr. Ricks, you want to give us a brief summary of this framework?
Absolutely. And so in the research that I completed in working on my dissertation, I looked at specifically the witnesses of workplace bullying. I found that to be a group of people that didn't get the spotlight enough. The focus went to the bully, the focus went to the target, but not necessarily the witness. And so in researching the witnesses' responses, I found that the number one feeling that a witness had, and by the way, there's 33% of individuals in the workplace are witnesses of bullying. That's 1 in 3. Their number one concern was that they felt helpless. They felt like, I don't know what to do. How can I help? How can I not be a part of the problem? How can I avoid getting myself fired and things of that nature? So these were the concerns that they had. And so putting together this model, this was a way for you to approach the target and try to help from that perspective. So first off, just communicating with that person. Hey, look, I understand that you've been experiencing these things at work. I'm seeing them. I'm seeing how it's impacting you. I saw you crying the other day. I saw whatever the case might be. Tell me what's going on. Tell me how you feel. Tell me how you'd like to go about addressing this. So then this person shares with you, yes, you're right. I am feeling bullied. I am feeling picked on. And so you say, look, let's coordinate efforts. And I want to encourage you to go and see something like our human resources department, or if we have a union or an ombudsperson or whoever it is that you report to in your organization, kind of that next level up. So help them coordinate that meeting if they're afraid to do so themselves. Now, usually when this is presented to something like a human resources department, they're going to launch an investigation. The investigation can be a tricky part. The investigation can last a couple weeks. It might last 30 days. It might last 6 weeks. And during that time, there can be tension in the air in the workplace while this person is waiting for the results of said investigation. So during that time, as the witness, be an encourager to that target. That's a tough time. Hey, look, hang in there. You know, maybe if you can get a situation where you're temporarily moved to different departments or something like that, so you're not having to directly interact with that bully during this investigative phase, that would be helpful. Then the human resources department or whatever department it is you have, they're going to get back to you and they're going to say, hey, look, these are the results of what we decided to do. We're either going to do nothing. We were maybe going to put this person on probation. Maybe we're going to suspend them. Maybe we're going to terminate them. I don't know what the case might end up being. Then you're going to evaluate whether you're okay with that response with the target. All right, are you satisfied with what just happened with this scenario? If you're not satisfied, then we need to proceed to something greater, which might be seeking a labor attorney, which might be the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. We may have to take it outside of the organization to really rectify this in a way in which you may be satisfied as we move forward.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rickson. You can read more about her model in this book. I shared the link in the chat. So opening it back up to the panel and to the audience, how do we approach someone? And this was a question submitted by a participant. How do we approach someone who remained silent in the face of workplace bullying? How do we approach someone?
I'd like to say really quick is that for me, I've been a witness to the bullying and also have been the target. And sometimes folks are just waiting for someone to say, hey, I see you and I see what's going on. And so not necessarily speaking to that person in public around everyone else, maybe catching them off to the side. And I smile because I think about a young lady that was being bullied and she walked into the bathroom one day and I just kind of followed right behind her. And I'm like, hey, I just want you to know I saw what just happened. And you don't have to suffer this by yourself. You don't have to, I'll be there for you. And so not allowing her to go through this bullying in silence was huge for her because again, you know, I can only speak to being a female firefighter, right? There's only 4% female firefighters in our country. And so a lot of us go through this alone and in silence, but just really taking the time to kind of follow her and encourage her, as Dr. Ricks had said, you know, and letting her know that you're not alone in this. I'm here with you. I'll encourage you and I'll stand by you was huge for her.
Thanks, Shelly. What else? How else can we approach people? We've got some great contributions in the chat, so certainly talking to them in private, sharing your own experiences. I'm gonna sort of bridge us to the next question. So one of the next questions is about this sort of unintentional bullying, which could often sort of be these microaggressive kinds of behaviors. And so often what happens is this is rooted in bias, right? And so bias is any kind of prejudice that's in favor of or against one person or thing or a group, usually in a way that's considered unfair. And we have explicit biases. Those are the things that happen in a conscious manner. And those things that are implicit happen in an unconscious manner. Now, for the most part, federal law prevents a lot of explicit biases, but it's those implicit unconscious biases that can be the most painful, the death by 1,000 cuts kind of scenario, and they are the hardest to prove. And so one of the questions we had from the audience is, how do we address this unintentional bullying?
This leads us to the discussion around emotional intelligence, which is something that's kind of been new to the overall conversation of how people interact with each other. And so you have to realize that you have to be able to pick up on emotions. You have to understand your emotions. You have to be able to read the emotions of other people. And so one of the main, well, I'll say challenges with that is that a lot of times people are not self-aware. So like you're just describing in regards to the implicit bias, this person does not know how they're coming across. And so that's why when you do have that one-on-one conversation that Captain Carter was just talking about, you're just saying, hey, look, from my perspective, this is what I have been experiencing from you over the past however long it's been. I've seen situations personally where this unintentional bully goes, oh my goodness, I had no idea I was coming across that way. I'm so glad you brought that to my attention. Yikes. Like, I'll make sure that never happens again. And sometimes it's just a matter of having that conversation for that person to have, kind of the scales removed from their eyes and realize how they're coming across to other people and choose to change their ways. Not everybody is going to fall in the sociopathic narcissistic category. Some people do choose to say, hey, look, I want to be better. I want to change. Thank you so much for helping me through this.
Yeah,
I tend to
go ahead, Liz. I was going to say that sounds like a great example of the positive response we want.
I tend to use I don't do it as much for myself, but when I see it happening to someone else, I know that people sometimes don't feel comfortable saying that someone's making them feel comfortable. And if I see someone clearly uncomfortable with the situation, I use a more soft approach. And maybe the next time I'm with that person saying, hey, did you notice this person was uncomfortable with that? Or I might tell a story that's similar about myself, and then point out the similarities between that story and myself in the situation, so that it's less, so the other person doesn't get so defensive, but has that ability to self-aware on their own, because you're much more likely to keep that self-awareness on that issue if you get to that point on your own, instead of having somebody kind of bring it up to your face and be like, you did wrong. Because they're not, that implicit bias isn't done on purpose. There isn't a conscious effort to be that way. So I kind of feel like when you can make that change to the box in your head yourself, it's a much better take.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Liz. Thanks, Dr. Ricks. So, one of the things that we know to be true is that communication is a skill. This book here is a book that I'm currently reading, Nonviolent Communication, A Language of Life-Changing Tools for Healthy Relationships. So I think that you could get a lot of tools out of that. Another book that I have been recommending for years is called Lemons to Lemonade. So if you run any kind of meeting, for me as a facilitator, and I've had all of my, consultants and instructors read this, that in order to be able to manage these kinds of bullying behaviors, these kinds of microaggressive, these kinds of, any kind of thing that sort of comes up in a workshop, this is a great toolkit for how to manage those different kinds of things, and recognize that it's a skill. So if you feel like you don't have that skill yet, you can develop it. And then a very classic book here is called Crucial Conversations, Tools for Talking When the Stakes Are High. So those are 3 books that might be able to help you build some resources and skills. And all of those books are again referenced here on the website. And so we've got just a couple of minutes left. And so the question I'm going to show a couple more books. So another book here is, we've talked a lot about self-awareness. So if you're worried that maybe you might be exhibiting bullying behavior, I encourage you to read this book by Dr. Tasha Eurich called Insight, Why We're Not as self-aware as we think, and how seeing ourselves clearly helps us succeed at work and life. And one of the things that she says in her book is that we should ask what, not why. And this is particularly helpful for us when we're dealing with a bully. Try to ask what, not why, right? Because asking why, you're never really going to find a why in most often cases. And prompting from that, I am also a huge fan of this book, What Happened to You? Conversations on Trauma, Resilience, and Healing by Dr. Bruce Berry and Oprah Winfrey. This is also, it helps you begin to have some insight to what's happened, potentially that person. It allows us to have greater empathy and understanding for them. It doesn't validate what they're doing, but it helps you begin to inoculate yourself from the impacts of maybe what's going on around you. So the last question I have for us is, what additional strategies and resources would you like to share? And so this is open to the panelists, to the group. I'm going to check the Q&A to see if we've got anything there. I don't see any questions that have come there. I think I got all of the questions in the chat. Wand, were we able to address your question throughout? You could drop that response in the chat, be great. So to the panelists and to the audience, what additional strategies and resources would you like to share related to workplace bullying and its impact on belonging?
I can jump in. I will say that one of the progenitors in regards to workplace bullying research is Dr. Gary Namey and Dr. Ruth Namey, a married couple based out of California. They also put together what's called a Workplace Bullying Institute, and you can access a lot of their research. It is amazing at wbi.com, I believe, Workplace Bullying Institute. So if you want to learn more about workplace bullying, I highly suggest you follow them.
That being said, with Dr. Ricks, I was just going to say the exact same thing, but including that is, I would like to just speak to a possible target, a person that is being bullied. My suggestion for you is to take care of yourself. You know, it could cause trauma, it can cause anxiety, health issues, and my suggestion for you is to take a step back, look inside yourself, go take that vacation, step away from the situation if you possibly can, and start taking care of yourself. Don't suffer in silence. It just makes matters worse. Get the help that you need. It's lots of help out there. And of course, if you ever need to talk, I'm available.
Likewise, Shelly, I echo that. And recognizing, like Sabrina, Dr. Rick said earlier, is that the impact of this can be tremendous on our bodies, right? You need to pay attention to your body. If you're experiencing, I had like lots of stress induced chest pains, right? I had lots of things that are happening. Sometimes the answer may be to leave, right? There are things that we can do to stay, but sometimes you just need to take care of yourself and not endure it. I want to invite you all to evaluate today's session. It helps us improve our services. I'm also will follow up with all of you with the resources that we shared, and invite you to tell us what we should do next, what kind of conversation we should have next. And so I, again, so grateful for your participation. Inclusive leadership is something that is also an answer to a lot of this, and I've got a ton of great resources on my website, free resources on inclusive leadership, including my TED Talk and a reflection tool and all kinds of things that you can access there. And so I hope that you'll find that useful. So we are just over time, but again, I just want to thank you all so much for your participation. I encourage you to reflect before you go. Take a minute to just kind of jot down some thoughts and ideas about what you learned, what you want to do different. And if you've got an action item, we'd love to hear it. And so at this point, any final words from the panelists? Any questions from the audience?
I want to extend that I'm available if anybody has questions, concerns, or would like to talk further. I'll drop my email address in the chat box.
Awesome. And I think I've got your website linked on from my website as well. Anybody who wants to hang on, you're welcome to. I'm going to change it so that you can unmute if you want to ask a question. if you want to unmute, if you've got a question, you can offer it to the group. Well, I didn't properly thank Captain Carter, Liz, and Dr. Ricks. Thank you so much for joining me. This was fun. I knew it was going to be fun. And I'm grateful for what you brought to the conversation today. And you all have such a wealth of expertise and experience. And so thank you. Thank you for that. All
Thank you for
right.
having us.
Dr. Pollock, this was fun, and I would love to have gone even longer. I think this is really good conversation, and I believe the folks that was on the chat really did. They took in what we had to say to either learn about themselves or become better at what they do. And so, thank you for this opportunity. It was great, and of course, Dr. Ricks, you're my hero. Thank you.
Thank you. And likewise, Captain Carter.